In a distinguished professor lecture that was part of the Open University of Hong Kong's recent Open and Innovative Education Week, Alan Tate, Professor Emeritus of Distance Education and Development at the Open University of the United Kingdom, tells the story of openness in higher education, analyzing the historical, pedagogical, and technological influences on this important and growing trend.
So I've given my talk this morning, my contribution, the title of The Story of Open. So what I want to do is to give you, from my own perspective, a British and a European perspective, something about the history of the term open in educational contexts, and then give you some sort of analysis of about how I think it is developing today. So I've got three themes. The first of them is what openness in education means, where it has come from. The second thing is to talk about how we manage to talk about dropout and student success, because they are corollaries, that openness brings challenges for student success, in my view, of a positive kind, but nonetheless, we have to be open and talk about it. And thirdly, what openness means for commoditization of education, a very prevalent trend in the UK, in North America, and I believe also here in Hong Kong. I want to begin by touching on some themes of communication, mass communication theory, and begin to refer you back to the European history of printing. Now, I know, although I don't understand, that the history of printing in China is older than the history of printing in Europe. But the history of printing in Europe began in the 15th century when a German printer invented moving type. At least he invented for the Europeans moving type. And this made it quick and cheap to put together books for the first time, because up until this time, books had been more or less handmade, so they were very, very expensive and rare items, artifacts. But it was Gutenberg in Germany who began this process of massification, began producing books in such a way that they were quickly produced and they were more cheaply produced, and therefore they were more widely spread. And so openness, I think, at least in European contexts, can be rooted back to this phenomenon of a much wider access to knowledge. And of course, what we can say about the book is that it is the first element in mobile learning. Books can be very easily carried, and books were carried. They were carried from court to court by kings and their officers. They were carried from university to university. Universities were already in the 15th century a European network of knowledge, as indeed they are today, and I hope will stay that way. So books, thanks to Gutenberg in Europe and his invention of movable type, began to open up knowledge in a way that was very, very different from anything we had known before. And the second thing I'd like to point to in the European history was the way in which railways opened us up to place. So railways began in Europe really seriously in the first decades of the 19th century, and they changed society. They changed the experience of being a human being in ways that were quite radical. They made it possible for the first time to live and to work in different places. So they created the whole notion of suburbs, of places outside cities where you could live, but you could travel from your suburb, which would be more green, more pleasant, less crowded, into the cities to work every day. So railways really began to change our understanding in Europe of place. And back in the middle of the 19th century, they permitted for the first time the beginnings of correspondence education. So they began the phenomenon of opening up education in Europe with correspondence education. So what happened was that with the development of the postal system depended on the railways to quickly deliver mail from one city to another. And the correspondence system in England, at least, began with a man called Isaac Pitman. And Pitman produced short courses for learning shorthand. Shorthand was very important for people recording court proceedings, recording parliamentary proceedings, and people had to be trained in shorthand, this strange code that they used for recording verbatim conversation as people spoke. And Pitman invented a short course. And you didn't have to live in London to take this short course. You could live, for example, in Manchester. And in those days, the postal system was better than it is today, I have to tell you. And people's assignments would be delivered very quickly back. So he invented the system of assignments. So he would set a task. The task would be in the materials, which you received by post, and you would send back your assignment by railway, by post through the railway, to Pitman, to the man himself. And he would mark the assignment and send it back to you. And it was a very quick turnaround by railway and by post. So we can see technology here, the technology of Pitman, first of all, with books, technologies of the railways and the postal systems, opening up education through mass production, through place, through new understandings of place. And this is a very important part of the history of open as we understand it today. I'd also like to refer you to the phenomenon of the telephone, because, of course, this radically changed human experience also. In Europe, the telephone began to come in on a widespread basis in the early 20th century, just after 1900s. That was really a very elite technology. Now, you must have been through the discussions about, over the last 20 years, about introducing digital technologies. How many people are we excluding? Is it an elite technology? Well, exactly the same discussions took place when the telephone came in. It was an elite technology in the early first decades of the 20th century, and it wasn't, in England at least, until the 1950s that the telephone began to be a normal technological instrument in everyday houses, in the houses of everybody. And what the telephone did, we take it for granted now, but what it did was quite radical in terms of changing human experience, because it made it normal to speak to somebody who wasn't present. So it changed our understanding of human presence. You could telephone somebody and talk to them, but they weren't in the same room as you. So we distanced the experience of synchronous communication through the telephone. Now today, of course, we regard that as absolutely everyday, normal. You walk around Hong Kong, everybody's on their mobile phones talking. But my grandparents, this was a new phenomenon for them, and they were never comfortable with it. They were never comfortable with talking on the telephone. Their telephone conversations were very short, very quick, because they found it somehow embarrassing or unnatural to talk on the telephone. They certainly couldn't have intimate conversations on the telephone. And of course, I listened to my wife talking to her daughter for hours on the telephone about the most intimate and close personal experiences. The telephone has changed the way in which we manage conversation. And it's been quite a radical change, which in England at least started on a widespread basis from the 1950s. So we made speaking with somebody a distanced experience for the first time. I'd also like to refer you back to something which has opened up the world, which I think we're in danger of taking for granted now, because it's only 20 or so years old, the search engine which first allowed us to search all the databases around the world. Instead of just examining the database in your own organization, the search engine, which began in early prototypes in Montreal and then was taken further forward in California, really linked us, opened up the world of information on a worldwide basis in a way that is hugely important. Today we take it for granted, but it's a very recent phenomenon. And the search engine is perhaps as important as for us Europeans the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg was. It has radically changed human experience, human access to knowledge. It has opened up knowledge in a way which has been truly phenomenal. So, that's a brief introduction and a very partial introduction to what openness in education might mean and how it has developed historically. And I think the first thing to say, openness has meant that it is an attack on the educational notion that quality means exclusion. It is not a victory, but it is an attack. Many institutions, many universities still say, as a matter of pride about our identity, that we exclude more people than we include. What's good about our university is that we only admit a few people. So we might have 10 people for every place. We might have 20 people for every place. So how do you know we're a good university? We exclude more people than we include. But I think this historical development of openness has actually provided a challenge to that, where there is a different definition of quality, and it is the definition of quality that my own university, the Open University in the UK, is committed to, which is that quality means inclusion. So we have very contested notions of what quality in education means. We have the traditional notion that quality in education means exclusion, now challenged by the notion of openness. No, what quality in education means is inclusion. We try to include more and more kinds of people, people from backgrounds which have not traditionally enjoyed university education, people who come from families who have never been to university. So one of the ways in which we define access in the UK is what we call first-time families, children who come from families who are the first ever to go to college or university. So quality now means inclusion. That is the challenge. And this has been an element of democratization in European societies since the mid-19th century. So this phenomenon of openness in education is also about the political process of democratization, of accepting more and more people as legitimate participants in the way in which our issues in our society are decided. And lastly, I would want to say that openness in education is also about a very important sociological phenomenon which I think we could term disembedding. It takes the local person out of his or her local environment and makes them participants in national or international affairs. So of course, as soon as you access a book, you are accessing more than local knowledge. You're accessing national or world knowledge. Before the availability of books, people couldn't access that. As soon as the radio, for example, became a widespread phenomenon, now we take it for granted, but as soon as, and this in the UK was maybe around the 1920s, people could start turning on the radio. The radio became a popular phenomenon in the 1920s, and they could listen to the national news every day. So they became truly national citizens for the first time, instead of just being local citizens. And now, of course, we are at one and the same time local citizens, national citizens, and global citizens. If you look at your emails in a week, what proportion of them come from outside Hong Kong, or from outside the UK, or from outside France? It will be a significant proportion. We are at one and the same time local, national, and global citizens. And I think this is part of the process, you could call it disembedding ourselves from our local contexts. And technology and openness has been a significant driver in this disembedding phenomenon. It has its challenges also. Where do you really belong? Where are your true loyalties? Are they local? Are they national? Are they international? It has its challenges. So let me just give you a little bit more detail from the British context about the way in which openness and democratization began in the 19th century. So we have this very, very interesting phenomenon in the mid-19th century, around 1858, of external studies. This is fascinating. The University of London in 1858 said, you may take our examinations wherever you are in the world, and we will give you a University of London qualification. You need never come to London. So they broke the link between study and place. They were the first, as far as I know, to do it. It was an absolutely radical link. I live in the city of Cambridge, where there is a university, the University of Cambridge. The University of Cambridge still has a regulation that to take a degree in Cambridge, you must live within 25 miles of the city centre. So for the University of Cambridge, the link between place and study is still enshrined in regulation. But way back in 1858, the University of London said, we will send you a curriculum, you sit our examination, wherever you are, and we will give you a University of London qualification. Now, how did this happen? It happened because of a phenomenon which you understand well here in Hong Kong, because of the British Empire. So the British had a lot of people living around the world. They couldn't study in the UK, but they could study at a distance. And then gradually, it wasn't just British people who used this system. Some of the local elites began to use this system. So in many countries, I'm sure in Hong Kong, in Africa, in India, Chinese people, Indian people, African people began to study with the University of London at a distance and gain a university education from the University of London, but they never, ever went to London. And some very important developments for our field grew out of this, because first of all, it was studied simply as an individual. Very, very difficult to sit here in Hong Kong, get a syllabus from the University of London, and then 3 years later or 5 years later sit an examination. So tutorial colleges began to build up. Colleges on a commercial basis began to say, well, we will teach you. We will prepare you for these University of London examinations on a face-to-face basis. And then correspondence systems began to grow up. So maybe you can't get to a tutorial college, so we will send you correspondence materials to prepare you for University of London examinations. So the phenomenon of distance education, at least as we British understand it, began with this radical experiment that the University of London began in 1858 with study at a distance, opening study wherever you lived. It didn't matter where you lived, to University of London qualification. And I jump now to what I hope you will allow me to describe to you as an important development in openness in education, namely the foundation of my own university, the Open University in the UK. And you'll see on my left, Michael Young. Michael Young was a very famous innovator in the UK, who died only, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. Michael Young was the man who invented the term for the first time, Open University. So Michael Young, back in 1962, was looking at an extremely elite higher education system in the UK. Something like 5% of young people went to university. They were almost entirely men, and they were almost entirely the children of the middle and the upper classes. So it was an extremely elite system by social class and by gender. And Michael Young said this is inadequate, and it's inadequate on 2 grounds, and those 2 grounds remain very important watchwords for my university. It's inadequate in terms of social justice, it's not fair, and it's inadequate in terms of what society needs in terms of educated and skilled people. It's simply an inadequate approach to the skills and knowledge that we need then in the 20th century. So Michael Young has a huge amount of credit for the concept of opening up education through an open university. But it was a politician, you can see him on the right here, Harold Wilson. He was very famous for smoking his pipe, and it was Harold Wilson who said, I want an open university in the UK. And like the famous ancient Greek scholar Archimedes, who had his best ideas in the bath, if you remember, Harold Wilson, it is said, he said, came out of church one Sunday, and on the walk home, suddenly it came to him, we need an open university. I need to do something about this. And so Harold Wilson was the politician who announced that there would be an open university. But he didn't do it. He asked a woman to do it. And it is a woman called Jenny Lee, who was Minister of Education. And he gave her what must have been a very, very difficult job at the time. Say, we're going to have an open university. I've announced it. Make it happen. That's what he said to her, make it happen. That was all he said. He didn't give her any instructions. He didn't give her any practical advice. So Jenny Lee was the person, and it was a woman who did it. So Jenny Lee was the person who, as Minister of Education, began to draw people together and say, how are we going to make this open university? How are we going to do it? And it was truly an idea that came out of the sky. And it had a number of elements in it which were not at all well received at the time. First of all, the Open University said, we're not going to recruit school leavers. This will be an open university for adults, for people who have left school and gone to work and started families. Secondly, they said, this will be a university that uses technologies for teaching. We don't think that teaching just by going to lectures and sitting in tutorials face-to-face is enough. We want to use, and in those days, the big fields of experimentation were TV and radio. We're going to use TV and radio. So those 2 things were important. And thirdly, they said, we're going to bring into university study people for whom this has never, ever been possible. We're going to bring in new kinds of people, poorer people, people from families who've never been to university. We're going to bring in disabled people who have never been able to go to university. And in fact, it's still true that the Open University in the UK has more students with disability than all the other universities put together. So Jenny Lee, as a woman, takes a huge amount of credit for making the Open University happen. She opened up education in a radical way for the UK, and I think it is also true to say in the more than 100 open universities around the world, that this has been a globally influential phenomenon. So where are we today? The Open University in 2016, my university in 2016. So it's grown. It's grown to around 180,000 students. The balance between undergraduates and master's students you can see there, and doctoral students about 500. That's important. So the Open University teaches at all three levels, bachelor's, master's and doctoral. In other words, it is a full university. This is not a second-rate university, it is not a college, it is a full university. And Jenny Lee was very, very determined about that. This was going to be a real university with real professors doing research and teaching. She didn't want it to be second class or second rate at all. I think that's a very important element if we want to support our notion that quality is not about exclusion, quality is about inclusion, that we have the status of a full university. There are something like 300 qualifications, and there are something around 1 million people carrying an Open University qualification after their name. So the system works. We don't just recruit people, we bring people through to success. They succeed in their study. So there's around 1 million people with after their name bachelor's or master's degree or PhD Open University after their name. So the system works. We have around 800 academic staff and something like 6,000 tutors. Now you'll be familiar with this division of labour, I think, because it's one that I think you use here in Hong Kong. Is used in Open University of China, which is the other big system I know about quite well. So our academics, this is too simple, but in brief, our academic staff create the courses and do the research, and our tutors teach the staff and relate to the students. So we have what you could call a division of labour. So the tutors are the front line with the students. They are part-time tutors, often having other jobs elsewhere, and our academic staff who work full-time for us create the teaching materials and do the research. So that's where the Open University is now. Somewhat challenged because we have a new fees system in England where government funding for teaching has been taken away and students pay the full cost of study, and that has hit student numbers because adult students find the full cost difficult to pay. So we have what I hope is a period of experimentation with fees. I fear it may go on longer than just an experiment. We'll see. So I think we can say that the Open University, with its embedding of the notion of openness in education, has pushed at a number of important boundaries. It's first of all pushed at the boundary of place. You can study anywhere and study with an Open University. In other words, you don't have to live in a city with access to universities. You can live in the countryside. You can be a sailor on a ship, and we have sailors on ships studying with the Open University. You can be somebody locked in a prison, and you can study with the Open University. And we have people in prisons studying with the Open University. So we've pushed at the boundaries of place. We've pushed at the boundaries of social class. So the social class of our students is different from those of other universities. We have succeeded in including a wider range of social backgrounds than was conventionally recruited for in traditional universities. We've pushed at the boundaries of gender. And although it is the case now in the UK that all universities are either 50-50 men and women, or in fact have more women than men, so the educational challenge in the UK now is boys, not girls. The whole thing is reversed. 50 years ago, we didn't have enough girls in education, in higher education. Now we don't have enough boys, so the whole situation has reversed. But the Open University has been from the beginning more or less 50-50 women and men. And that was a very important step forward in its day, and that is still the case. We've pushed the boundaries of disability. So we have students who are blind, we have students who are deaf, we have students who are restricted to a wheelchair, we have students who are restricted to their beds, who have successfully studied with the Open University. So we have pioneered ways of supporting students with disability, which had never, ever been done before. And we've changed the whole culture of higher education about who can study, because 50 years ago, it was said that people with many disabilities, well, of course they can't study. Of course it can't be done. We have changed that culture of what is possible. And we've had, from the beginning, at undergraduate level, at bachelor's level, a radical policy of open entry, which I believe we share with the Open University of Hong Kong in your distance learning program. So our students choose us. We do not choose our students. This is a fundamental reversal of the normal principle in universities. So it has been a matter of pride for many, many British universities. Of course, we choose a very select group of students. Very particular kinds of people are admitted to our university. We don't choose our students. Our students choose us. We have an open entry system. And there's always those who say, and we still have them in the UK, well, we don't know why you do that. What is the point of educating people like that? And we have resisted that culture from the beginning. So we believe that it is right in a democracy, if we want educated citizens, that everybody should have the opportunity to study at a university. Not everybody will succeed. Of course, that's true. So we have exit standards, which are the same as all other universities. And we know they are the same because we have this system of external examiners in the UK. You may be familiar with that in other parts of the world. So we have academics from other universities who sit on our examination boards and who sign to say the standards in these examinations are appropriate for a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a doctoral degree. So we know our exit standards are the same as all other universities, but we are open at entry. And in fact, for our bachelor's program, we have more or less one-third in the following way. So we have more or less one-third of our students who have below the normal university entrance examinations. We have more or less one-third with the minimum university entrance examinations. We have more or less one-third with more than the minimum. So more or less one-third of our first-year bachelor students could not study at any other university. They would not be permitted to do so. So they choose us. We have two-thirds who could, and they also choose us. So this is the Open University mission as it is this year. We've retained a very long-standing slogan, which is the first one there. The Open University is open to people, open to places, open to methods, and open to ideas. So you see there, I think, this joining of social justice and innovation. Social justice because we're open to people and to places. We want all kinds of people in all places to study with us, but we retain our commitment to innovation. This is very important because I've had the opportunity to travel quite widely in my professional field, and it is sometimes surprising how quickly an institution can start out as an innovator and become conservative. So we have to maintain in an open university our commitment to innovation, to doing new things. We promote educational opportunity and social justice by providing high-quality university education. You'll see the word quality in there, very, very important. Quality in the standards of our qualifications, absolutely not negotiable. An open university degree is accepted in the UK as a real university qualification. To all who want to realise their ambitions and fulfil their potential. So we're open to all people. And then lastly, you'll see that we aim to be a world leader in the design, content and delivery of supported open and distance learning. So that's the Open University mission in its contemporary writing. It's not very different from what it was 50 years ago, but that's as it is today. Now, we have to engage with this question of dropout and student success, because openness means that you allow people, you encourage people to study who have not traditionally been supported in your higher education system up till now. And what is absolutely true is that when you do that, more people fail. So again, let me refer to the other university in the city where I live. The University of Cambridge has probably less than 2% dropout per year. Probably less than 2%. My university, in its first year, has dropout of around 50%. Does that mean we are doing a terrible job and Cambridge is doing a wonderful job? I reject that completely. We are doing different jobs. Because Cambridge would define its excellence by exclusion, and we define excellence by inclusion. So we are doing different jobs. So the first thing I would say is that it is certainly true that we have more dropout in open education than in closed education. But that is not to do with the status of the university. We have contested notions of excellence. And so people will say that to you, well, open education is second rate, look at your dropout. But I think that is to misunderstand the reality of the phenomenon. It's not because part-time education is not as good as full-time education. So if we look at dropout rates, at least in systems that I'm familiar with, you have a simple hierarchy. Exclusive education institutions have low dropout because they select only the very highest ability students who come from the families who have paid for the best schools, so their children, their young people arrive in their universities very well trained, with the culture of higher education already because their parents probably went to university before them. So we have a simple hierarchy. So full-time exclusive universities will have the least dropout. Part-time universities or part-time programs will have more dropout than full-time. Not because their students are stupid, not because they are bad systems, but because part-time students have to go to work, they have families to manage, they have a lot of pressures on them, much more pressure than young people full-time on a campus. And distance and online modes of study usually, although not always, but usually have more dropout than part-time face-to-face study. And again, that is because of the pressures on our students. So it is perfectly true to say that there are risks and challenges with openness. So I'm being very open with you today about the dropout rates in my university. There are risks and challenges with openness, and we must have a responsibility to students. What we must do is organize our support to students appropriately. So we must recognize that some of our students will arrive without the culture of higher education, without the confidence that middle class and wealthy students have, with the pressures of combining work, family, and study. So we must think about how we support students in those situations. These are, in my view, this is a very good summary of the pressures of dropout on, this particular study was for online students from an American colleague. And these will be entirely familiar to all of you who work in this field. So the pressures are about time. People don't have enough time when they're studying online because they are working and managing families. They have pressures on self-management. Do they have the skills and the resilience to manage their time, to manage their energies well for study? How do they combine study with family? I'm sure your students tell you when they're working online and at a distance that they get pressure from their family. Why don't you spend your weekends with us anymore? Why are you spending your weekends studying all the time? What are your responsibilities to your family? So they will get pressures from their family about study. Another major factor is logistics and support. Logistics, the practical management of the timely delivery of resources, in fact, is not a word we use often in online and distance education, but actually it's very important. The putting together operationally of good quality services for our students is crucial. We need people in our open and distance education systems with those skills that come from industrial management. Knowledge and understanding of logistics is crucial to the quality of education. It's not just about what we academics do, it's about what our managerial colleagues do too. They are equal partners in this enterprise, so logistics is essential in managing dropout and student success. And lastly, of course, we must have curriculum relevance. When you ask students who do drop out from online programs and distance programs, the most popular response is the program wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I thought the course was boring. It didn't interest me. So they've made a bad course choice. And I sometimes worry, and I'll tell you this, I sometimes worry about my own university, that while we have been innovative in the ways in which we teach, we have not been innovative enough about what we teach. Adult students do not necessarily have the same curriculum needs as 18-year-olds going to university. Now, this is very difficult because, of course, qualifications have to find a place in society. They have to find a place in a marketplace. You have to be careful how you innovate with curriculum. But we have to think very carefully about what our students want to study. It has to be relevant to their lives as adults. It has to be relevant to them in their workplace. Many, the majority of our students will have aspirations from study which are to do with their employment, to do with their career. They're also to do with personal development, but they're going to be to do with their occupation, with their professional development. We have to think about this in our curriculum relevance. So those are the major factors, I think, that contribute to dropout. And those are the major factors that we have to try and mitigate as we develop systems to support students. Is openness and inclusion worth it? If we have these higher rates of dropout, we have challenges, is it worth it? And I think there are at least two approaches to this. The first is what you can call a rights-based approach, that in contemporary understandings of democracy and society, it is the right of people to benefit from all the goods in society. The goods in society are not restricted to a small number, to an elite. We must make it possible for all to benefit, or as many as possible to benefit from the goods in society. So this is what you can call the social justice approach, that social justice demands we have higher education systems which are open to all. But secondly, and this is an argument that appeals to many politicians, we need in a society of the 21st century to have an educated and a skilled workforce, and we need to have an educated citizenry. So you can see that openness can actually draw, in political terms, on a very wide agenda. It can draw on the agendas of social justice, which are attractive to some people, some people's political theories, and it can draw on the agendas of skills and knowledge for society and economy, which draws on the agendas of other people's political philosophy. So openness, if we want to develop this narrative of excellence in our own terms, can draw on very wide political agendas. Don't be trapped only in the agenda of social justice, because that will not appeal to everybody. There is an agenda also of economic and social development. We had a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer who, when the Open University was first announced, dismissed it as blithering nonsense. He thought the idea of the Open University, this very senior politician, was absolutely stupid. It was stupid because it was talking about part-time students. It was stupid because it was talking about adult students. It was stupid because it was talking about using TV and radio for teaching, whereas everybody knew that teaching took place like this in lectures. And it was, you might be surprised to know, a Conservative Minister of Education who refused his instruction to abolish the Open University before it had started, Margaret Thatcher. So there we are, a politician of the right said, no, I actually think this institution has something to offer British society. So although a Labour Prime Minister invented the Open University, a Conservative Minister of Education saved the Open University. And that's why I say openness as an educational philosophy is attractive to political agendas across the board. And there is, in any case, no way back to an elite system. Our societies simply couldn't afford to go back to having 5 or 10% of young people only going to universities. So openness is with us to stay. And to develop openness in today's world, which is where I want to go now, information and communication technologies are central for all higher education systems. So let me come on now to the contemporary phenomenon of openness, other openness. We have, and these are a very interesting set of developments, open source software. So open source software has been developed as a resistance to proprietary software, which is extremely expensive. And we have these communities of software developers creating software freely available for use and adaptation. And of course, the example that's most familiar to us in our field is the phenomenon of Moodle, which my university uses. It's a community-developed higher education software system. I don't know whether it's used by other colleagues here in this room, but it's not proprietary. So you've got proprietary examples of learning management systems like Blackboard, very familiar to us, widely used, but there are non-proprietary open software, and it has very, very many users. And what's very interesting is that we have, at the same time as a more commoditized world, this pushback in the open movement in many areas, in software certainly, of an anti-proprietary ethos. We have open access publishing, another phenomenon of openness. For example, in the journals that we as academics depend on to disseminate our work, journals are extremely expensive. University libraries pay a fortune for journals. We have new entrants in our fields in open and distance learning, which are free online open source journals. You may know them: Irodl, published from Athabasca University; Eurodl, the European journal, published by the European Distance and E-Learning Network; the Turkish journal, DOJDE; and lastly, the Journal of Learning for Development, published by the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver. All of these journals are of increasingly high quality and are open for you to read without cost. So this has been a phenomenal change in the last, what would you say, 15 years only. They're based on Creative Commons licenses. We have books increasingly being published in open mode. So Martin Weller, a very renowned scholar in the open education field, published his recent book on digital scholarship as an open book. You can read it On the web, you can download a PDF and read it completely free, but if you want a paper copy, you can buy one also. Very importantly, we have journeys from informal to formal learning through open media now. So we have these range of new media, iTunes, YouTube, and OpenLearn, which is the Open University's own social learning platform. And if you just look at the numbers there, this is informal learning, people using free learning resources produced by the Open University. The statistics are phenomenal. Look at the number of people wanting to learn online, free. They're greater than we could ever reach through formal education programs. They are absolutely extraordinary. And this tells us something very, very important as educators, that the passion for learning exists on a very widespread scale. There is no problem with demand for learning. People want to learn. And what's more, they want to learn using digital resources. They want to learn online. So it's a huge responsibility on us as educators to work out how we can provide opportunities on anything like the scale that we see here. Which brings me on to talk about Moocs, massive open online courses. Moocs, whatever you think about their quality, and the quality is of course variable, demonstrate demand on a huge scale. There are more than 20 million people using Moocs around the world. The passion for learning online exists. We don't have to invent it. We have to invent ways to satisfy it. Dropout is certainly huge, but of course, many, many people don't start Moocs with the intention of finishing because they don't lead necessarily to qualifications. It is true that the quality of pedagogy is questionable. I've studied a number of Moocs myself. I'm sure many of you here have done also. I've seen very, very strong Moocs, really pedagogically innovative Moocs, and I've seen really terrible Moocs, really boring Moocs. So the pedagogy is certainly variable. But what Moocs have certainly done is created in the research-intensive universities, which have not cared about learning and teaching up till now, for the first time, very significant conversations about using digital and online teaching methods in their own resources. So we know Harvard, for example, telling its campus-based students that studying a MOOC is part of their program. So we have digital learning moving onto the campus big time. And I think it's very important that those of us who work in open universities in particular don't assume that nothing is changing in the campus-based systems. Campus-based systems are not today what they were 20 years ago. There's a lot of digital and online and innovative practice going on the campuses. And lastly, I just want to say here that another thing I think we learned from Moocs, at least in England and in the USA, is that there is a very significant resistance to the price of study. The price of study in North America and in England has now become very, very significant. I think we see the unique status of open universities being eroded because, as I've said and I've emphasized, technology is now seriously on the campus. Our open university is going to continue to lead through innovation. As I travel around the world, I have to tell you, I see some open universities falling way behind. Some open universities are trapped in their original founding mission, trapped in the way that they did things for the first 10 years and not innovating today. I see campus-based teaching being reformed and enhanced with new understandings of pedagogy and new understandings of technology. And I see overall a desperate need for graduate skills to be rethought so that our students leave university with the skill that they desperately need for their personal, their social, and their professional lives in managing information and in virtual collaboration. And these, in fact, are things that distance programs, online programs, can teach better than any other mode of study. So part of my urge for you to support the narrative of excellence for inclusion is also a narrative of excellence for online teaching. We can teach the skills, some of the skills which our graduates need better than campus-based programs. And I think that's very important and something we should hang on to. So we have a battle of ideas going on. Education is a contested domain. Is education a private or a public good? Is it a commodity or can it be tax supported? Is it for those who can afford it or those who want it? And there was a very famous French Prime Minister who I think had a singularly unsuccessful career, But I remember something he said with great fondness, Lionel Jospin, I'm remembering, who said, do we want a market society or do we want a society with a market? Very different things indeed. And I think that is a question that faces us in educational policy, and openness lies at the heart of that battle. Thank you very much indeed.